If you've been diagnosed with hidradenitis suppurativa, also known as HS, or you have these really awful boils that develop under your skin and become extremely painful, I want to talk to you today about diet interventions. Basically, what diet changes can you make that could actually make a sizable difference in the amount of inflammation and overall suffering that you may end up experiencing as a result of this condition. Some people will actually go completely into remission by making diet changes. Not all, but I do think that there are some general dietary changes that can be helpful regardless of where you are on your journey. And I want to share with you which ones that I like to recommend and where to start first. As I already shared, diet can be a really powerful tool. I think in most instances, chronic illnesses in general can be positively impacted by making dietary changes. And hidradenitis suppurativa, or HS, is no different than that because there is a significant component of inflammation and what's driving that inflammation under the surface. So if you are experiencing this, and yes, I do deeply understand the significant level of pain that you may be experiencing when you're going through a flare-up, especially as the disease progresses into later stages, it can be extremely debilitating. And there are probably moments where you're like, I will literally do anything. I would say that diet is a great place to start. There's certainly other strategies, and I've talked about them on the Healthy Skin Show, and I will link up to those in the show notes for you below. But that being said, diet in and of itself can potentially modulate, reduce, or even stop the inflammatory process that drives these awful lesions. Like, I will never forget literally feeling like I had this giant softball-sized inflammation in my armpits, as if somebody had bunched up a sweater, and I couldn't quite move. I couldn't work out. It was just awful. And so for everybody out there struggling this, no matter where your HS actually shows up, I really truly get it. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, it is basically up to about 4% of people who end up getting HS. So it's not a whole huge amount of people, but it is a sizable enough of us who've experienced this that we know that having just one flare-up alone is enough to make you be like, I need to take care of this because this is not good. And there's another really interesting statistic that about 33 to 40% of people who struggle with HS actually have another first-degree relative who also struggles with HS. So there could be some genetic components, and there's definitely things that we're still learning as research evolves. Now, we do know that there are significant connections with metabolic syndrome, liver issues, and fatty liver specifically. Another issue that can trigger HS, and we're not entirely sure why, would be hormonal changes. And we do see some really interesting research around androgens and elevated androgens, so that may be a contributing factor, but how exactly, I don't know that anyone is really entirely sure at this point in time. While I do want to throw this out there that this is linked to obesity, I think it's not fair to most people out there to assume that you have to be overweight or obese in order to get HS. I was not obese or overweight. In fact, I was really, really super active and very athletic when this happened to me. So if you don't fit that narrative in what the conventional system deems as someone at high risk for HS, no picture right now is really truly perfect. And I think we're still, again, at the infancy stage of understanding who's impacted by this. Smoking is another factor. So if you do smoke cigarettes, that will put you at a greater risk of this condition as well. But generally speaking, this underlying kind of silent fire of inflammation is what drives HS. And right now, if you were to go to the doctors and you were to get treated, your options are kind of limited depending on where you're at. In the beginning stages, which is where I was before I finally went into remission, I was constantly on and off antibiotics. That was basically the only thing that I figured out that could help me. And I tried Chinese medicine, herbs, all sorts of stuff. I even tried detoxes and whatnot, and just nothing helped. It was literally just antibiotics. And if you're like me and you were early enough in your journey to possibly consider laser hair removal. Yes, I just said laser hair removal. That was actually what got my HS to go into remission. And it was a tip that I got randomly from a person I did not even know had experienced HS. I actually talk about it in this episode. As the disease progresses and there's increasing tissue damage, the problem is that you can't just do antibiotics, which in and of themselves are not great to do endlessly, right? So we're looking now at more serious medications to try to control the disease, some of which are biologics that also carry some really kind of scary side effects that people can get nervous about. For some, they're really a blessing. And I don't want to belabor the point that all conventional options are bad. They're not. Sometimes we need those things and it's okay to reach for them. But when things get really bad, you're looking at surgery. While I'm not a big fan of diet eliminations and cutting a whole lot of food out of your diet, I do think in this particular instance that certain key eliminations could actually be helpful. And there is some research to back it up. So let's talk about that. So if you were to ask me, what should I cut out of my diet if I'm struggling with HS? I would say there's a few ways to go. And you should know the more general rule of thumb. And then let's talk about different tips and ways that you could possibly get into the diet changes that don't necessarily mean that you have to upend your entire diet so that it's driving you nuts and you feel extremely restricted. And who's to say that even smaller diet changes won't be effective? Because sometimes they are, and you don't necessarily have to dive into the whole 9 yards of things. And to be fair, some people are just like, that's not practical. Given my lifestyle, given my work schedule, all sorts of stuff, I can't do some sort of major dietary change. I can do some things. That's reasonable. So let's figure that out. In general, the rule of thumb for hidradenitis suppurativa diet changes include what is known as AIP, which is the autoimmune paleo protocol. Now, that in and of itself is a fairly restrictive diet. That being said, it does focus on whole foods, which is something that is really important, right? We're eating more whole foods, real foods, than we are packaged and processed foods, which I think is a good thing. Another few bigger buckets, I would say, are also reducing your sugar intake. So probably going close to low to no sugar at all, possibly going dairy-free. And the big one, and this one might surprise you, and it's kind of a weird random one that doesn't fit in with other skin conditions, but to actually do a yeast-free diet. Now, let's start with AIP. What does that actually look like? So for the most part, you're cutting out things like legumes and grains. There's no alcohol. We obviously are going to avoid sugar. A lot of times people will cut out nightshades and they'll do no dairy. Those are kind of the big sweeping pieces to it. So we're eating mainly meats, other proteins like fish. We're getting a lot of starchy vegetables that are really colorful and good for you and full of phytonutrients, a lot of leafy greens. You can have some fruit, but again, being mindful of that. And there is a whole dietary template set up around this. Then we've got dairy-free, which by the way, does not necessarily mean egg-free. And I will acknowledge that some iterations of AIP will even cut eggs out of the diet too. So you can kind of see what I was saying about this being a pretty kind of restrictive diet template. Some people are able to follow it while others can really struggle. And maybe the place to think about this is like, could you do it in sprints? Could you maybe do this for 30 days? Could you maybe do it for 2 months or 60 days? Find a way to commit to something for a period of time and then slowly start reintegrating things. But in general, the dietary changes that you can make can, like I said, potentially put your HS into remission. So with that being said, I do want to talk to you about what the research says, because I recognize that when you go into Facebook groups, people make kind of sometimes wild claims saying, oh, well, this really helped my condition, whereas other people say they did the same exact thing and it didn't help them maybe as much or at all. So let's look at what the research actually suggests. That way we can kind of balance between what we see clinically, right? What happens with people in real life versus what has been studied. I always find it fascinating the difference between what research tells us and what actually happens in real life. And I think that's one of the intersections of being a clinical nutritionist that I have to navigate, is trying to figure out, like, do I follow the research 100%, or do I also factor in the nuance that comes into cases? And so some of the things I'm going to share with you, and I've already talked about, are based off of clinical observations, right? There isn't necessarily research to back it up. These are things that I've either learned from other practitioners, I had an idea about and saw patterns in clients, but I also saw some research and I tried to test out how well that really worked in real life, in real bodies, right? Because that's really important. We should always consider that, because research isn't always 100% accurate. And if it's a smaller study, for example, which, to be fair, a lot of the research right now in HS are smaller studies, we can't always depend on that. So let's start with dairy. There is some research on the removal or elimination of dairy in hidradenitis suppurativa. And at this point in time, I can tell you that it may be helpful for some individuals and it might make no difference for others. In my particular instance, I developed HS when I was dairy-free. I hadn't had dairy in like 6 years. So we can't blame dairy as a trigger, because clearly it was not. That being said, there was one small study of about 47 people where they found that I think somewhere around 83% of the participants seemed to feel that the removal of dairy actually did make a noticeable, sizable improvement in their condition. The details of that study and what those participants actually removed was very unclear. In another study that was done on 700 HS warriors, they asked those individuals answering the survey to identify what they would consider HS triggering foods. And in this particular research, the researchers discovered that about 16.8% of respondents said that dairy was a trigger for them. What we don't know is, did they just take out dairy? Did they take out dairy and other foods? We literally don't know. They did not qualify that information. So unfortunately, again, we're kind of left with this very murky situation. So I think the best thing that you can do is give it a test, give it a trial for something like 30 to 60 days, because none of these things necessarily should be permanent forever interventions. Even AIP, which again can be very difficult to follow, is not meant to be followed forever. After about that 60-day window, you should start trying to reintroduce foods. So dairy might be one of those foods, it might not be, but either way, I just wanted to give you a fair shake on dairy. Now we've got to talk about yeast, because you probably were like, yeast free? What does that look like? And I don't blame you, because this is where it gets tricky. And I will talk in a moment about why a yeast-free diet might actually help. The research around the removal of all yeast from your diet, so a completely yeast-free diet, is pretty much based on very small studies. So there was one 12-month study with only, admittedly small, 12 individuals with HS. Now, these individuals all removed every ounce of yeast that they possibly could from their diet. That was in total. So they could not have alcohol. They could not have yeasted breads and baked goods, all sorts of stuff. It was fairly extensive. And the fascinating piece to this was that every single one of them put their condition pretty much into remission. And when they began reintroducing yeasted foods was when the flares started again. One of the reasons that I do think that a yeast-free diet could be helpful for you to try, even if you were like, look, I'm not ready for AIP, but maybe I'll give a yeast-free diet a go for 30 to 60 days, is because there seems to be a higher incidence of people with hidradenitis suppurativa who actually test positive for the Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody. This is a blood test that your doctor can run. It's available through conventional labs, and they test positive for this. And most of the time, those who test positive for this particular marker find that when they remove yeast from their diet, they actually really improve their HS. So that all being said, I do think that regardless of the fact that many of these studies are kind of unclear or they are done on smaller groups of individuals, are worthwhile to take note of and pay attention to. Should we take them as the absolute truth? No. Because again, you might not be consuming any dairy at all. You may have been dairy-free like me for many years, and all of a sudden you start developing HS. But either way, I think that depending on your particular circumstance, your particular case, at the least, some type of dietary change could make a significant difference. So let's talk about where I would personally recommend you start in terms of testing out, playing with your diet to help reduce that inflammation that we oftentimes see driving hidradenitis suppurativa. I have to be honest with you because the diet changes, if you make them all at one time, are probably for most people not sustainable. I'm just going to lay that out there. So that's one reason why I think it's important to start some other things first, see if that works before you really dive into the deep end, especially with AIP and blending all of these things together. The first thing that I would do is add higher zinc foods to your diet. For some reason, and we're not entirely certain why, higher amounts of zinc can be helpful. Now, I'm not going to get into dosing of supplemental zinc. That's a completely different conversation, and I actually talked about that a bit in this particular episode, so you can check that out there. That being said, higher zinc foods look like shellfish, oysters, other crustaceans. You can do different seeds and nuts. Like I love cashews and pine nuts with seeds. It could be pepitas and hemp seeds. You could also try different legumes. So if you like legumes, again, this is sort of why you start here and don't go to AIP that cuts a lot of these things out. But the higher zinc foods are potentially an option to help improve the HS inflammation under the surface. And why there tends to be an improvement with higher levels of zinc, I can't tell you. We don't exactly know, but that's where I would start. The next step that I would try is to remove or drastically reduce the amount of yeasted foods in your diet. So yeah, trying a yeast-free diet. This can be really tricky. So if you're going to do this, you should know right up front that you cannot do anything that is yeasted or has yeast in the ingredients. That would also include fermented foods. So we would start off with cutting things out like baked goods, breads, again, anything with yeast. So that would be baker's yeast, anything that has brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast in it. Those would all be no-goes. You'd also need to avoid moldy foods like, and I know you're probably like, I don't eat moldy foods, but some people actually do eat moldy foods like moldy cheese, blue cheeses, for example. So anything that has yeast in it would be cut out of the diet. And again, I would probably give that a good 30 to 60 days to see how that helps you, or you could try getting your doctor to run that blood lab that I mentioned in the previous section and see if that helps you. Beyond that, I would really try to limit your sugar intake. So that would be to cut out all higher glycemic fruits and focus on things like berries, lemons, limes, green apples, things of that nature, and probably swapping out any additional sweeteners for things like monk fruit or stevia. Trying to really minimize the glycemic index. If you're gonna cut out sugars, I would technically consider any really processed white flour to be in that category as well. Part of the reason why this is so important is because of what I mentioned earlier with people who develop metabolic syndrome, and that putting not only you at greater risk for developing HS, but also for kind of exacerbating flares. And so we know that when our blood sugar is all over the place, that puts a stressor on your liver. It also puts real stress on your blood sugar and everything. So anything that you can do to support better blood sugar balance is going to be helpful. Exercise being one of the main things. And I know that can be really tricky, especially when you're in a flare. And I know, because I shared with you in the beginning, that when I would get a flare in my armpit, there was no way that I was able to exercise because exercise made it worse. I could not sweat. So I totally and completely get that. But anything that you can do to move the bigger muscle groups, like your legs, can be actually quite helpful in improving blood sugar balance. Beyond that, and if you're not really sure whether your blood sugar is stable or not, you can do a 2-week continuous glucose monitor trial that could be helpful. Now, I actually did one of these, and it's one of the devices you put on the back of your arm. You can scan the device with your phone, and it'll help you see what your blood sugar looks like throughout the day, especially in response to foods and other stressors. And I did that whole review here, which you can check out. So again, that can be helpful. From there, I would start looking at your liver health as well. If you really want to dive into liver detox and all of that stuff that is integral to managing your metabolic health, I have a great liver detox deep dive masterclass that is filled with tons of tips and strategies to help you get that kind of nailed down and understand how to look at your liver detox picture. You can check that out here and also in the show notes. And if worse comes to worse, you can also add some supplemental liver support into your diet and your regimen. That can be helpful. Things like my P2 Detox Balance can be extremely helpful for supporting one of the most common phases of liver detox that gets completely overrun, including in Hidradenitis Suppurativa. A couple of other diet tips to try would be adding a lot of bitter foods and dark leafy green foods to your diet, because again, those are really helpful for your liver. And you've probably heard people talk about this online, but I do think that it's helpful, and I'll explain why in a moment, is removing gluten from your diet. You don't have to necessarily cut it out in a really super strict fashion like someone with celiac disease would, but to minimize or eliminate it as best you can be really helpful, because a lot of times folks with HS have issues within their GI tract that are causing inflammation. I want to explain that to you quickly because that actually ties back to the medication route that I discussed earlier in this episode in regards to biologic drugs and drugs that can help reduce the inflammation under the surface. And we have to ask ourselves, where does that inflammation come from? And the inflammation in chronic skin issues, not always, but a big chunk of it does come from what's happening within your gut. So if you've long suspected that, or you've read articles about leaky gut and all this stuff, you should take that seriously. And at the least, removing gluten helps reduce the impact of whatever mess is going on in your gut from extending quite immensely into your body, right? So it just kind of helps not necessarily reseal the gut, but it does help reduce gut permeability, which is the scientific term. With that being said, I do think removing gluten can be a helpful tip. So back to the inflammation part. One of the newest biologic medications to be used to treat HS is something called an IL-17 blocker. IL-17 is a cytokine. It's sort of like a chemical messenger that your body produces in response to something. Specifically, you're gonna go, oh, this makes sense now when we talked about all the yeast stuff. IL-17 is this messenger that's produced in response to candida and other fungal organisms. Yeast are fungal organisms. So if you have an excess amount and your body is basically sending out into the system all of these messengers being like, hey, we've got a problem inside the gut, they go out into systemic circulation and begin wreaking havoc in other areas of the body. So that's where, if you find that the AIP diet is not sustainable, maybe even doing just yeast-free and some of these other strategies is not sustainable, or it doesn't work enough, looking under the surface in that kind of root cause approach that you may or may not be familiar with can be incredibly helpful, because what's going on in your gut, what's going on under the surface in terms of the GI tract, the gut microbiome, digestive health, liver detox, and nutritional deficiencies can all play a role in exacerbating or calming hidradenitis suppurativa. And I love helping clients figure that out in my clinical practice. And it's not just looking at your gut, by the way. There's other factors like mold exposure, nervous system regulation, mitochondrial dysfunction, like all sorts of stuff that happen throughout the body that can play a huge role in driving the inflammation that drives HS. If you're wondering what the heck could be your potential triggers under the surface, I have a guide that helps you hone in on your specific root causes. You can actually download this entire checklist here and go through it yourself to help give you a better sense of what could be going on under the surface. So can diet be helpful? Absolutely. And I do think in the case of HS that diet changes may be a good way to go. They could be something to play with, something to try. And again, you don't have to dive into the deep end. You can start, as I suggested, in some other areas that aren't quite so complex and complicated and require so many gymnastics to help you work around. There's always the chance that the diet itself, and usually it is a stricter diet, could put your condition into remission. But that is not everyone. And I want to be honest with you. Not everyone ends up in remission. Some people might experience a significant decrease in their flares, so they're not quite as painful. But if you can't sustain the diet, because admittedly, a more restrictive diet tends to be less sustainable, and you want to work on those root causes, the things under the surface that we don't necessarily see, that conventional medicine does not necessarily pay attention to, that could be driving the inflammation and fueling this entire process, know that you have options. There's a lot of things that you can work on. There's a lot of things to explore. So I just want to give you that hope. Now, that being said, if you've gone down the rabbit hole and you've really changed your diet and maybe geared it around AIP or removed yeast entirely or whatever it is that you did to help your HS, I would love to hear your experience. And I'd also be really curious to know what percentage you feel like those restrictions or eliminations actually helped you obtain. And how sustainable was it for you? Are you still able to do it today? Or was it something that you could do for a period of time and then you just kind of totally fell off the wagon? Take a moment and leave your comments below. I would absolutely love to hear what your experience has been. And if you want to check out all the references or you'd love to read the transcript of this episode, you can go over to skinterrupt.com/385. I've linked it up for you there to make it super easy for you to dive into. If you found this episode helpful, hit the thumbs up if you like this topic and you'd love for me to make more content around HS. And subscribe to my channel so that way you get access immediately to our daily content as soon as it's available. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to diving deeper with you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this video, you need to tune in to this video next. Then make sure to hit the subscribe button so you get notified as soon as a new episode drops. I'm excited to see you there and dive deeper with you on your skin healing journey.